Hello, welcome to part 7 of the Suzuki GS550 Cafe Racer project. Today I've continued to strip down the bike by removing the wiring harness and electronic components. The bike came with this nice little lithium battery which sits under the seat hump and it's secured in place using Velcro. It sits just above this Motogadget M-Unit digital controller. Before doing anything else, I'm going to remove the battery. The regulator rectifier is mounted here on the underside of the undertray using 2 bolts. I'm rerouting the wires from the Motogadget M-Unit to the regulator, and I'll remove the regulator later. The starter solenoid is mounted here underneath the rear of the tank. Again, I'm rerouting the wires that go to the Motogadget controller. I'm now removing the ignition switch. It's located here on this angle bracket on the left side under the front of the seat. All the wiring's exposed to the element, so I'm going to be replacing this with a new switch that's mounted inside an enclosure. Back to the Motogadget controller, I undo the wires from the main part of the loom before rerouting it through the frame and reattaching the wires to the controller. I now remove the rear brake switch, tail and brake light and reroute the wiring to the controller. Next, to remove the horn, which is attached to the frame here underneath the front of the fuel tank. I unbolt the left and right coils. These are attached here under the centre of the tank. Moving on to the left handlebar switch, I undo the bolts that secure the cluster to the bar. The starter and brake switch wires cross over to the right handlebar, so I'm removing the heat shrink tubing to expose the wires. Back over to the left switch cluster, I cut the wires and remove a Motogadget mo.button and indicator light. Up to this point I didn't know it had the mo.button fitted. After inspecting the mo module, I can see that some of the wires are being repaired and covered in heat shrink. A couple of the wires have their insulation broken and have wiring exposed. One wire has all but one strand of wire broken. Moving back to the start button, I remove the wires and the switch. I mark the ignition leads and remove them from the spark plugs. I then move back to the ignition coils and reroute the wires. I remove the rectifier from the undertray by removing these 2 bolts. Next, to remove the starter motor cover. This should be fastened using 2 bolts, but one of the bolts is missing. I'm removing the engine cover next, so I'm going to drain the oil. I undo the sump plug using a ratchet and socket and let the oil drain out. After all the oil's drained, I remove the filter cover from the front of the engine by removing these 3 bolts. I remove the oil filter and wipe away the excess oil. I mistakenly thought that the filter screws in, but it doesn't, and instead you just insert it into the housing. I now remove the alternator and starter motor cover by removing all of the bolts. As I remove the cover, I feed the wires through the casing that come from the rectifier. I mark the wires, undo the bullet connectors, and I feed the wires through the casing. I I then reattach the wires to the rectifier. Next, to remove the leads on the starter motor. This is the lead that comes from the starter solenoid. Lastly, I remove the starter solenoid. With all the components unfastened and the wires rerouted, I can now lift out the complete wiring loom. And this is what it looks like. I hope you enjoyed today's video. If you would like to follow the project, then please click on the subscribe button. Thanks for watching. Cheers.